In this video, I thought I would take a look back at a controller that I owned many years ago. A controller for my computer, actually. It's a very unusual sort of controller. It is the Microsoft Sidewinder Dual Strike. Let's check it out. This is the Microsoft Sidewinder Dual Strike. It is a strange controller. We'll certainly talk about it. Let's get it out of the box first. Inside this box that screams 90s PC gaming tech is another little brown box. And within the brown box is the controller itself. In addition to the controller is, of course, the software disk and a manual somewhere in there. So the first thing I think is worth noting is that the build quality on this thing is very nice. The plastic doesn't feel cheap. It's a little light, honestly, especially when compared to a Xbox 360 controller. You can also see that the size difference actually is substantial. It's kind of a big controller, but not overly big. I think it's actually more comfortable than the Duke, if you know what I mean. The original Xbox Duke controller. It's more comfortable. It's pretty ergonomic on the back here, little grips, and the location of the you might want to consider them trigger buttons, but they're just regular buttons. Are very nice. The controller itself is meant to emulate other control devices. The swiveling side here gives you full motion in three-dimensional space. It works like a mouse, basically. The best explanation I have is this thing came out around the time that Quake began gaining popularity, and it would make sense for things like that to come about. I mean, trying to capitalize on it while still holding on to roots of old school gamepads. That's kind of where this fits in. It's somewhere in between. People weren't entirely comfortable with switching over to a keyboard and mouse configuration to play games, and this kind of sat there in the middle. And, you know, I had one. I ran across it at a Big Lots. It was on sale for like a couple bucks, and I grabbed it, took it home, set it up, and was not impressed, if I remember correctly. Anyway, the thing originally came with a software disk that you could install on your computer and configure it in multiple ways, and basically have configurations that you could automatically load with whatever game you were playing. With Windows 10 came a lack of support. Actually, I don't believe this has been supported since Windows XP, and even then I think it was spotty at best. But fear not, there are ways to configure it. If you use things like XPatter or Joy to Key, there are utilities you can download and use to make this thing work. I actually use Joy to Key to make this work, so I had to do some configuration to try this out and actually make it work. Once you've gone through the headache of configuring your Sidewinder Dual Strike, it's time to play some games. I thought I'd start out with some Quake, since that is what the controller was designed for. You'll notice that I spent a lot of time looking up, looking down, lurchy, uneven movements. It's obvious that I'm very confused as to where I'm going, what I'm doing. Basically what's going on is I'm losing track of which way the controller needs to be moved to look up or down. You can also note that aiming is terrible. It is insanely hard to zero in on an opponent. Next up, I decided to try out Doom, which was a little bit easier, being that Doom doesn't require you to look in all directions. There's no real mouse look available in Doom. So the configuration was pretty simple. I just configured a way to move left, a way to move right, a button to activate your strafe, a button to open doors as an action button basically, and finally I used one of the triggers as a trigger. This worked pretty good, but once again it felt a little clunky, but I think that was partially because of the thumbstick, the POV hat, felt funky. It never felt quite right. It wasn't bad, it just didn't feel right. But if I was being honest, it worked, and it worked okay. I just don't think it worked well enough to justify playing the game with this controller. There's absolutely no advantage in using this controller for this game. And lastly, I tried out Sonic CD on Steam, actually. This worked about as good as anything else possibly could. Frankly, this was the best game for the controller. And I pretty much attribute that to the fact that you only have to configure two things, your directions and finally an action button. So that worked okay. I didn't have to use the mouse look part of the controller. I didn't have to use the triggers. I only had to use one of the face buttons and the POV hat. It worked fairly well, but because I'm really not used to the controller, it never felt intuitive to me, at least not as intuitive as a 360 controller. But I imagine that if I kept trying it out, I would get the hang of it. So let me give you some final thoughts on this thing. As a controller, for basic games, this wasn't that bad. I mean, it was comfortable, it felt okay, but compatibility issues alone make it really hard to recommend this, right? Because you're going to have to jump through some hoops to get it to even work on modern systems. Next up, the whole controller. This is intended for three-dimensional games. Games like Descent, games like Quake, games like Doom. Things where you would actually use the mouse to look around. It didn't work well. It wasn't intuitive at all. And even flipping my axes, I would switch back and forth, being able to reason out which direction was correct way to look up or down. Aiming is very clunky with this. You can't get a smooth movement, a smooth look when you're looking around. It's very jagged. It's either all or nothing, and it's hard to be precise in any way, shape, or form with this thing. The other thing you got to worry about is making sure you've configured every single possible combination for whatever game you're going to play, and that can be a bit of a pain in the butt because you've got to go into the configuration file and you've got to look up and see what key commands do what, and then map them using a third-party software to make work. I mentioned earlier that I had one of these. I had one of these for Windows 98 actually, and I remember distinctly trying to play Slave Zero and never being able to keep track of which way I was supposed to be aiming. I don't know, there's something not intuitive about moving your hand like this. It just doesn't work. Thumbsticks seem to work much better. I don't know, and it might be because of the way our brains are wired now, especially these days, since this is what we do a lot. Maybe that's why it works a little bit better. All in all, the controller is a very interesting piece of video game history. I would not recommend hunting one down at all. If you are an avid collector of things like this, fine. Go hunt one down, put it on your wall, keep it to yourself. But as far as getting one to use, you're really better off just sticking to an Xbox 360 controller if you choose to play games with a controller, or even just a keyboard and a mouse. If you like this video, please make sure to check out some of my others, and to make sure that you stay on top of things, please check me out on all the various social media outlets, and of course subscribe. That way you're always up to date on new videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.